Hey friends, we have some news from our sponsor Text Control. They just released version 32 of their document processing library, which includes new core functionality such as document footnotes, SVG export, and more. You can integrate document editing, signing, collaboration, and PDF processing into your ASP.NET Core and Angular applications with Text Control. These powerful libraries will let your developer teams focus on their core competencies, while Text Control handles your digital document processing. Check out all the new features and see the technologies live in action by visiting the demo at demos.textcontrol.com. That's demos.textcontrol.com. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Julia Minamata. She is the developer of The Crimson Diamond. It's a mystery adventure video game in the style of many of the text adventures you may remember as a child. Certainly I loved playing games like this. It's just blowing up the internet right now. You can get it wherever you get your games. You can check it out at thecrimsondiamond.com and at juliaminamata.com. I'll put links in the show notes. This is such a unique game. I had to have you on the show. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Scott. I really appreciate it.
So this is a narrative-driven mystery game. It's an adventure game, and it is done in an EGA style. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, it's this very incredibly specific of a short era in like DOS gaming history. I would say from the late 80s to early 90s that they used this specific 16 color palette. And they used it because that's what they had at the time. It was cutting edge. And soon after they moved on to VGA and onwards. But this era, this is the one that really stuck with me as a child. It was kind of like, my golden age of what I loved so much. And I kind of continued on even into my illustration career with enjoying limited color palettes.
And there was CGA, there was EGA, where the E was enhanced, and then VGA was when we got that term 640 by 480. And when you get into VGA, you have 256 colors. You constrained yourselves to EGA. It's a 16-color palette?
Yeah. I know CGA is that cyan, magenta, white. That is the default. That one, I will admit, is a little hard to love. But I still do love it very much. And I do have fond memories of playing like Epic's winter games and summer games and things with that color palette. It's deeply unusual and very unconventional. But EGA is kind of that middle ground. It's somewhat more representational of, I don't know if we could call it real life. But what I love about it particularly is when we moved on to VGA, at least in the early days of VGA, the backgrounds in adventure games were painted backgrounds that were then scanned in, downsampled, crunched. They were basically, you had the painting and you had this in-game art that was, I don't want to say inferior, but in a way that it was, because they were working still with these very, very stringent limitations technologically. But EGA was always meant to be on the screen. And that's the thing I think that really captured my imagination and really inspired me. The colors of EGA will only ever look best on a screen. Those bright colors, and the graphics were ultra crisp, ultra clear. The differentiation between the background and the characters and the objects, it didn't exist. If the whole world feels unified in a way that early VGA, at least, it didn't, because the sprites had to be limited color palette, but the backgrounds were kind of like blurry, I would say, anti-aliased painted backgrounds.
Yeah. I think that there was a time also when we hadn't quite discovered anti-aliasing. You can't do a lot of anti-aliasing, or at least very, very minimal with a 16-color palette. Advanced 21st century pixel art is a thing. We've seen a rise of excitement around pixel art, even pseudo 3D pixel art with light shading. And there's entire courses that you can take to learn about how to do that. But it almost seems more work than I would be willing to do. I'm curious, what did you paint this in? Did you just go right to paintbrush, or did you build your own tools to do this kind of work?
This was done in Photoshop, but I will be the first one to say that you don't need anything close to Photoshop to do pixel art. And that's part of the reason that I love pixel art in the first place, is that you can use there's so many different kinds of software. You have Sprite, which is excellent. I use something called Medibank Paint sometimes if I'm on an iPad. There are free programs all over the place that will do what you need to get done. The only reason I use Photoshop was I have this comfort level with Photoshop, having been a freelance illustrator for more than 10 years, growing, just using it every day for decades, literally. I just have that super comfort level with it, and that's the reason why I use it. But I would recommend to anyone who's interested in pixel art or limited color like EGA color palette art is not to go with Photoshop at all. You definitely don't need it. It's definitely overkill.
This is meant as a compliment, but it may not come out as one. So bear with me here.
Mm.
There is an opportunity when doing pixel art, especially kind of like at angles or isomorphic, to get a satisfaction in perfect angles.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like you almost went out of your way to embrace some of the imperfections of the low resolution, the drapes, angles, the wood has almost like hand-drawn wood lines to show the grain, and the spaces when they're in the wood in the log cabin could have been very much like drawn with a ruler.
Mm-hmm.
It feels imperfect, but it doesn't come off as unprofessional. How did you find that balance between perfection that you have as an opportunity with pixel art and in kind of embracing that imperfection?
Yeah, so this is an interesting concept with pixel art or with any type of digital art, it can be easy to just flip something if you want. You just do half of something, flip it. You can do that with faces and all kinds of things. But what ends up happening is you'll find also with the face example in particular is that it does look unnatural. It does look like stiff. It does look artificial. And I've always tried to make things that looked handmade and cozy and all these things, which can be difficult to do digitally. But I've worked on other projects where we had like profile photos, profile artwork in something called Recommendation Dog that I did with Playdate. And I was the art director for that. And one of the art directions that I gave to my junior artist is we're doing hundreds of these faces. We maybe did a couple hundred faces, like by hand. And the thing I wanted to remind him most of was I don't want just the faces to be mirrored. We were trying to do them quickly, but I didn't want them to be mirrored. They could be kind of mirrored, but then I want some of each side to be a little bit different from each other. Because of that, you get this uncanny feeling sometimes if you see a perfectly symmetrical face. And I was very conscious about what I was making. I wanted to give it that super warm feeling. And in terms of like the pixel perfect perspective and things like that, it's almost it's a bit of a limitation when you're working at a low resolution, like 320 by 200, which is what the game is in, to sometimes you only have so many choices. You have one angle or these two angles. And if if you want an angle that's between the two angles, you just don't have that choice. You have to make one choice or the other. And it does force interesting decisions to get made. And I will say that perspective is not my strongest point, but I will also say that when I started to develop the rooms for the Crimson Diamond, I was looking at a lot of Sierra adventure games, just screenshots of Sierra adventure games. And as you know, from an art student background, I started to dissect what the perspective was like, and then just to see like how they're working with these. And the secret to these backgrounds is that they don't do good perspective either. It's all a magic trick. And part of the reason for that is because the sprites are not scaling. That there are still angles that they're using in their rooms to show depth, but from the front of the room to the back of a Sierra background, that sprite is not changing size at all, even though it does look like things are getting smaller toward the rear of a background. And I found that to be fascinating because I had never thought about that, having played these games for hours as a child. And I kind of took that on board for when I was making the Crimson Diamond. Is it's all an illusion. And hopefully people are not going to, call me out for, the perspective. So far, so good. People have not called me out on the perspective not being absolutely perfect because it's certainly nowhere close to that.
That makes sense. I never realized that. Like you spend a lot of time in the lodge and there's like beds. The bed that is closer to the screen is not any larger than the one that is farther away, but it doesn't matter because it feels comfy and it feels right. And I think that's the other thing is that was your intent to make a modern take on a classic or a classic that could be transported back in time and you would say, oh, wow, this is one of the best Sierra games I've ever played?
The goal was to make something that would play like people remembered the games playing. In a way that fuzzy nostalgia feeling, those rose-colored glasses looking back on them, I had the benefit of decades of development and design iteration from back in those times that I could look at and learn from and say, okay, well, these are the ways that things were happening very early on in this genre's development. I can improve upon these things in all these different ways that I've seen other games do. And honestly, that was technically speaking, that was the goal. But the number one goal for the game, from an emotional level, was to recreate that feeling of being a kid and having no worries in the world, so to speak, and having a game to play that's new. And for this game to look and sound the way it does and play the way that it does, and be something like that could have been back in those times, but is new for people. I wanted people to get that comfy feeling of nostalgia, that excitement of having another, so-called gem to get to experience.
Yeah, I'm big into retro gaming, and I often find that going back sometimes doesn't always work.
Hmm.
Like I want that cozy feeling, so I'll retreat to something I played 20 years ago, and it's just like that doesn't really hold up. What a bummer. You definitely split that perfectly because it does hold up. It is delightful, and it feels better than those go back. If you go back and play King's Quest 3, it's hard to do that, but the Crimson Diamond is a joy. I want to pivot a little bit because you're, not just a game developer, and it's not just the Crimson Diamond. You're like a classically trained. You've done silkscreen, and you've looked at lithographs and woodblock prints. Are you an artist or are you a developer? And how do you identify?
Yeah, I went to school for illustration. I have a Bachelor of Applied Arts illustration, and that's what all my training is in, and more formal training at least. And I was a freelance illustrator for about 10 or so years. I worked primarily in magazines and newspapers, and I got a couple illustrations in the New Yorker even, which is like the high point, I think, for me. And yeah, I tend to identify more with that. And it's interesting coming from that background and then becoming a game developer and meeting other people who had that same trajectory. We kind of approach things in the same way, and not it's and I was speaking on something else yesterday about this, where there's a difference between starting as an artist and then becoming a programmer, or learning programming later, or being a programmer first and then learning art later. Um, I find that the artists, they are so accustomed to kind of taking the tough way to do something, which is just a grind. Because acquiring the skill of being an artist is a grind. Like there are no shortcuts to becoming a good artist. You have to put the hours in. You have to train your eye. You have to train your hand, technique, everything like that with different media, all that stuff. There are no shortcuts. But programming is all about shortcuts and finding those easy solutions that work logistically, that you can understand in your mind, and skipping all of those other steps that you might have to, if you didn't know a certain thing or other thing. And I find that those two approaches really interesting, because I've even in my newsletter, honestly, Scott. So I have a Crimson Gazette that comes out every month, and there's a part where I have to copy and paste HTML to put into my announce list so I can send that out to my mailing list. And I have to copy and paste like the first part of the HTML address and paste it into every single image link, because I can't figure out how to update those links, automate that. And every single month, so this time it was 71 that I had to do. I had to copy and paste it 71 times into the image link of every single one of my images that's in this month's Gazette. And it's just a grind. And, programmer would be cringing and screaming and saying, no, 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 Julia, we could be saving you minutes, and that would become hours of your life to figure that out. And for me, I'm like, okay, I'll just do it the slow, dumb way, and I'm going to get it done, and I'm going to move on with the rest of my day. And that's the difference between people who are artists first who to turn to programming. I just find it a very interesting, but yeah, it's a short way to say that is, yeah, I do identify more as an artist than a programmer. I did the programming. I kind of learned that all on my own.
Interesting. But I will kind of challenge you a little bit, because you didn't take the easy way and make this like a more Day of the Tentacle, left click, right click.
Mm-hmm.
You made us type. This is a text game in that you are typing, look at the cupboard, open the door. Why did you choose that? Because if developers are lazy, you could have kept me from having to type anything.
I sometimes think about how much easier the programming would have been had I done a point and click. In just my idle moments, my quiet moments of reflection, I think, oh boy, because there are so many instances where the text parser has, for me as the designer and the programmer, posed so many difficulties and issues that I wouldn't have had to approach had it just been a point and click adventure game. And I guess what it comes down to is when I started the project, I was not thinking about how do I sell this to the most people that I possibly can, or even how I'm going to make a game and how do I do that.
Mm.
It started with as just an art project of creating pixel art rooms to see if I could recreate that style in pixel art. And I was just kind of learning how to use Photoshop for pixel art. And then it slowly kind of grew from that to becoming more something that resembled a game. And then when I showed it publicly, the demo for the first time, I saw such a really positive reception that I thought, okay, well, I'm going to expand upon this and make it into a game. But the reason it was started as a text parser to begin with is because it is my favorite way to interact with a game.
Mm.
It is compelling and it is immersive in a way that it's I think it's really hard to get from point and click. It kind of forces you to engage with the writing and parse what you're reading and take the parts out that you know could be useful to you, or take your cues of what is a noun you can verb from the written descriptions in the game. And it gives this impression of limitless possibility. When you're talking to a character, you don't know what you can ask them. There are no dialogue trees in the game. You have to figure that stuff out from what you see around you and what people have already said. And I've always felt that way. I mean, I've played other adventure games, and the ones that I tend to stick with the most and the ones I enjoy the most are the text parsers. And the reason I did it that way is because I thought, I haven't seen this very much anymore. This just doesn't happen, and I can see why, because you are automatically limiting your audience with, for so many reasons. Like, I don't have a consideration for doing a console port or anything like that because the game does require a keyboard and quite a bit of typing. But that was, yeah, my primary goal for it is this is what I'd like to see more of in the world. So I'm going to try to put something out that is what I want to see more of.
That right there is a very artist and illustrator perspective. The idea that why am I doing this art? I want to see more of this. So I will be the first and I will put more of this out. And maybe other people will see it and they'll put more of it out as well. So I love that perspective. Hey, friends, as I spend the next couple of months learning more about AI, I'm going to take a moment in the middle of the episodes and I'm going to bring in Leendert van Doorn from Qualcomm to help me better understand some of the work that's happening in their space. I've got a new Copilot PC. It does amazing things with the Snapdragon X processor. It runs AI locally. But I understand that you can also run Linux on these processors as well.
Yes, absolutely. Windows obviously is absolutely the main focus of these platforms, but we have also ported Linux to it. And more important, we've made all those changes open. So they're out all in the open. And I think that to me is one of the big switch or big culture shifts that are happening within Qualcomm. We're becoming much more collaborative, much more open. You'll see you've seen a bunch of acquisitions around Foundries.io that we made in that space specifically to become more open. Linux is interesting because it opens a bunch of other vertical to us that we didn't really have before. Like there's a bunch of gaming, there are Android use cases that all build on top of the Linux work. So yeah, I would say stay tuned there. But for now, I think the key thing is it's all open, it's out in the open, and it shows the changing culture within Qualcomm.
That's so cool. Qualcomm embracing open source software to empower developers in that next generation of AI applications. You can learn more at qualcomm.com/developer. I did feel like you made me into a programmer though, because I have to learn how you want me to code this thing, open cupboard.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the end, I'm using shortcuts and I'm doing, like, I'm not saying ask about the lodge or ask Albert. I'm saying A-B, L-O, and I'm starting to figure out my shortcuts. So I end up becoming lazy towards the end. And you've taught me basically the programming language of Crimson Diamond, and makes me move around faster. So you don't make me type everything out, once I learn what I'm doing.
Yeah, that was that came as a result of getting player feedback where, I do say that there is a lot of typing in the game, but there are, various reasons why people can't type very much. Like there could be dexterity issues and any kind of limitation. And it's something I could easily implement with my fairly limited knowledge with programming, that it seems to make a big difference for people. And I'm happy to do that whenever I can, and give that option. Now, that's just a choice people can have. There is an in-game notebook. You can use it, or if you don't want to use it. There is a hyperlink to an online hint book. You can use it, or if you don't want to use it. There, you can make it a graphical inventory or a text list inventory, depending on how you want to play it. And I'm a big fan of people getting to choose how they play a game. And I'm also a big fan of me trying to meet them a little bit part way on that as well, because I already know that a text parser game is a bit of an ask, because it's not a format we see very often. And it does demand more of the player. That if I can make that experience in any way more hospitable to somebody, or more approachable to somebody, within my, again, limited resources and things, then I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I love that you do that, because I don't have the time or the patience to try to get through a Sierra game and get stuck. I don't know. I can't tell you how many times I got stuck in Day of the Tentacle or Space Quest and just gave up for a week and came back. And the notebook makes that possible to just, I don't want to go and Google how to get past this. The game should say, all right, you just got too hard. Now let me get past this so I can continue enjoying myself. So it scales the difficulty, I think, very nicely. I noticed, though, that you said with your limited development knowledge, and I love that I'm getting to push back on things that my interviewees are saying. You have a game. I just want to remind you, Julia, how successful you are. You have a very popular game in the Steam store. You can get it at itch.io. You're a game developer doing interviews about a game, and you're saying with your limited development knowledge, what did you write this in? And how did you write a game if you're not saying that you're not a developer?
Okay. I wouldn't say that I'm not a developer. I just
there you go.
I will cop to that, but I will also say that I do feel I'm a bit limited by my knowledge gaps and my lack of training and
as are we all
of that. Yeah, to be fair. But so this game is made in an engine called Adventure Game Studio. And Adventure Game Studio is an open source, freeware, community maintained software. I think it started in 97, potentially 95, 97, something like that. It's been continually updated since then, which by the community, which is still a fantastic community. Other fellow Adventure Game Studio developers include Francisco Gonzalez, who made Lamplight City, Dave Gilbert of Wadjet Eye Games, who made Unavowed. Kathy Rain was originally programmed in Adventure Game Studio. And what it does is it makes it relatively easy to make a standard kind of adventure game. In fact, even the text parser, there is a text parser that is baked into the engine. It doesn't get used very much. I probably am the one who's used it the most, but it's there, and it has every type of save and load functionality. All these things are already built in. And there are templates. You have the Sierra template. You can do a verb coin interface. You can do like a LucasArts scum bar interface. They're all packed in with the software. And what I love about it is it does make it much easier for people to make an adventure game, like a standard type of adventure game. And the community makes it much easier when you have questions. You can ask people questions about it. There are tutorials on the internet. I've actually recorded my own AGS tutorial that covers all the basics. That's on my YouTube channel as well. It was what made it possible for me to do this, because looking back again at the Sierra games or LucasArts games, those people were making their tools as they were making the games, often at the same time. I spoke to Doug Herring, who made the art for the Colonel's Bequest, and he was one of the people who created the tools. I think it was it on an Atari 2600 or something they were using to make that art? I can't remember what he said, but something fantastical like that. That doesn't even sound real. But they had those 2 months, they had that artistic mind and the technical mind, and to such an extent that they were building those tools. And I am benefiting from all the advancements that we've had since then, where I have Adventure Game Studio, which is purpose-built to make adventure games. I have online tutorials where I can learn these things, and there are forums online that I can then ask my questions if I get stuck anywhere. And it was kind of the perfect time when I started this game, probably early 2000s, I would say. Well, like when I very first started to dabble in Adventure Game Studio, like maybe mid to early 2000s. That was perfect timing for me, because that was kind of when I was ready for it.
This was demoed, I think, for the first time in 2018.
Yes.
It's hard for myself as a player of games who's never actually made a game to get a sense of how these things get made and how long it is. Are you working like they say that an average full-time job is like 2,000 hours or 2080, I think is the number a year. Are you working on this for 6 years, 2,000 hours? Is this a side gig? 6 years is a long time.
6 years is a very long time. And it was not a full-time gig by any stretch of the imagination for most of the development, I would say. Probably the last 2 years is when I started to focus completely on the game to finish it, and I wasn't taking any contract work on. In the intervening time between November 2018 and launch, which was August of this year, I also did contract work. I did art for 3 different games. I did art for Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator. I did art for Witch Strandings, and I did art for Recommendation Dog, and I also art directed Recommendation Dog. And that was all through with Strange Scaffold with Zellifer Nelson Jr. And I also did some narrative consultation, cultural sensitivity consultation. All those things were part of what I was doing in that time. And then it was only with the last 2 years where I told myself I really need to buckle down and finish this game. Because what happens is, because my game, I've self-published the game, I don't have anyone telling me when it needs to be finished. It was all up to me to decide when that was. But the consequence of that is as soon as I got contract work, it went right on the back burner. And it stayed there until the contract work was finished. I love the contract work, and I would love to do more of that in the future. But it did mean that my game was always sort of the second priority when it came to it, which did increase that development time, and also the fact that this is the first game I ever made, which means I had to learn a lot in that time as well, and I'm still learning.
I've heard that there's the making of the game, and then there's the packaging and putting it into the store. And some people have said that's as hard as making the game, like just putting it into the damn store. Excuse my French. Mm-hmm. Was that hard, or does Steam and itch make that easy?
Oh my goodness, it was one of the few times where I felt like giving up. And
just giving it, like runs on my machine, but getting it to anyone else. That's the part.
Where I consider myself a pretty determined person, but getting the demo up on Steam and then getting the final released game up on Steam with all the different, there's a press preview, build, and then there was the full release build, and then the demo, and just wrestling with all those things, especially with the demo. I distinctly remember when I was struggling to get the demo up on Steam, I was thinking, I guess that's it. I guess no one's going to see this, I guess. And that was the closest. I mean, it was not really close to ever giving up, and I never really felt close to giving up, but it was the closest I ever had to giving up, was wrestling with the Steam backend. And I will say, to its credit, the Steam support I've always found to be excellent, and they always respond to me promptly. But I will also say that I have friends who are software engineers and software developers who have said that it's still for them a struggle to work with it.
Interesting. Yeah, I was talking to an indie developer who has apps in the Android App Store, the Windows App Store, and the iOS App Store. And they said that that's 50% of the job. Yeah. And that somebody should make that push a button easy. And you've been really active with the patches. Are you watching the forums? You're by yourself in this. There's just you doing the dev. So do you have a bug reporting backend, or how are you getting the feedback then when you find a legitimate bug?
Yeah, so that's all chaos too. I don't have a lot of real good systems in place. So what happens with that is I do check the Steam forum for bugs that get reported. There's also a feedback email. The most of the feedback comes through the feedback email. I stick it into like a Google sheet where I log, the email address. So sometimes people are super helpful, like they'll link video or screenshots. So I'll log their bug with a priority, level, and then also if they've attached additional supplementary material so that if I need to, I can refer back to the supplementary material. And then I just kind of chip away at it here and there until I feel like it's enough to warrant an update. And then I'll push an update. Yeah.
When you put it out, was there any fear and anxiety that there'd be some kind of like, oh, I'm stuck and no one can get past this? Like, did you have enough play testing? Because I always hear about like game breaking bugs or the save game is corrupted and I lost 10 hours.
There is never enough testing, and I had dozens of ways. I was frightened, to death about the launch of the game, because it's something I had taken many, many years of work on this thing, and I put a lot of hard work into it. And it all kind of comes down to this one point of failure of the launch. And if you don't launch well and you lose all that momentum and everything, then, all that hard work is not going to get seen by nearly as many people as you would hope, at least at the beginning. And launching on the Steam store, from what I've heard, is all about keeping that momentum, like getting that momentum initially and then keeping it. And it was very stressful in the last couple of weeks. my testers were incredible, and I'm so thankful to them. But you just never know, And there have been a couple soft locks here and there that people have found in the interim, but luckily nothing really critical, I would say. It's just been, yeah, I would chalk it up to probably 75% luck and 25% hard work that we didn't come upon critical after launch. Because, like I said, I mean, as hard as my testers were working on, and as hard as I tried to make it, a nice clean build or everything, there's so many ways it could go wrong, especially considering adventure games are pretty simple in design, I would say, but what increases the complexity is the story and all these different flags that have to be checked for the story to progress, and a bunch of different things that players can see or won't see or miss, and all these things, and you just have to keep track of all those things. And again, I did not have a good system for these things. That's another thing I have to investigate for the next one, which I do hope to make. But it seems to have worked out for the most part, and no one's really noticed anything too bad, at least at this point.
Well, see, that was my next question. So now that it's had such a great launch and people are so excited about it, is this a thing that you can do again? Can you make it a whole Agatha Christie long series of these where, like, one of my favorite books is Jack Reacher, and I never realized that I had, without even realizing it, read 19 of them. Like, I would consume the Crimson Diamond Part 2, Part 3, Part 12, like those whole A for assassin, B for, bludgeon, whatever. Like how many of these do you think you can make, and how many do you think you have in you?
Well, I will say that I have a huge Google Doc of notes for the sequel, and I have a pretty clear idea of what I want that to be and the things I want to include in that. And I'm very excited about that. And I also have a feeling that I would love to do a third one. I have no idea what the third one would be, but it almost feels like it'd be nice to have a trilogy of games that are similar, and just kind of carrying over. I would keep the same EGA look, the same kind of Roland MT32 synth music type of sound, same text parser interface. And I'm kind of hoping that will mean that the next one will take less time. But I've heard a lot of game developers say that same thing. They'll say, "Oh, the second one is going to take so much less time. I've got it all figured out." And then they go on and they scope up and they become much more ambitious. And I'm certain that I'll also do at least some of that. But I'm going to try my best to make this one in a bit less time than the first one took to make.
Will it still be EGA, or is it going to be VGA and then Super VGA? You're going to keep scaling up?
No. See, EGA for me is not just a stepping stone on that technological, or whatever that is, whatever we'd call it. I was going to call it a stepping stone on that ladder, but that just does not make any sense. I don't see it as something where an advancement from that is something that I would desire. For me, that is exactly the format that I find so pleasing.
Yeah. The last question I wanted to ask was, I thought it was interesting that, there's a lot of stories that when I consume a piece of media, I think, oh, I've heard that story before. I've seen that before. This is interesting because it's in like 1914 Northern Ontario diamond rush. I'm like, I don't know. I know very little about that part of the 20th century, except for the war. I don't know anything about Canada in that context. How did you pick that time, that place? And do you think that helped people get excited about it because it's something we've never seen before, or at least the average American hasn't seen?
Well, you mentioned Agatha Christie earlier on, and that part of the reason for the era that I did set this in is thinking about that golden age of detective mystery, where we have Agatha Christie, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton. That style of kind of cozy mystery is its actual genre, cozy mystery. That was kind of the heyday of that, was sort of the early 1900s, I would say, which is part of the reason why I chose that era. I just also find that era very appealing. Also from a practical standpoint, it's people, writers often complain about how difficult it is to make, a crime or mystery story in an era where people have phones and little cameras in their pockets at all times and things like that. I like the idea of simplifying it down to a classic cozy mystery, Agatha Christie style, where we have the limited setting of just the lodge and concentrating on that and the surroundings and the people's, their movements from chapter to chapter. That all super appealed to me. And that's part of the reason I would say. Also, historically speaking, when I came up with the story of having Crimson Ontario be an abandoned mining town, it just so happens that around that time of history, just preceding that time of history, like I'd say the late 1800s, Canada was really trying to expand into those so-called frontiers, is what they called them at the time. I mean, the people were living there, but they just weren't, white European settlers. And this idea of encouraging settlers to go onto those lands to fortunately, I guess we could say, Canada is rich with all kinds of natural resources, like lumber and nickel and cobalt and silver and all kinds of things. And that was one of the main driving factors toward people going out into those frontiers and settling in places. And that's also a main reason why a lot of them became ghost towns, like the way Crimson does in the end. I found that the research for the game to be very fascinating. Knowing that I didn't want to actually populate an entire town, and just knowing I wanted to concentrate on one small region, it felt like when one of the most rewarding parts about doing something creative like this, where you kind of control every aspect, is you start seeing how things kind of fit together like a puzzle, even though you kind of made up the pieces yourself. And the idea of having it be set in an abandoned mining town in Ontario, which also is the perfect timing to be an Agatha Christie style cozy type of mystery at the same time, worked together so nicely that it almost felt like that was the way that it was meant to be, if I could use that.
That's cool. Well, what I'm hearing in all of this and in all this time that we've spent together is the thought and effort and intentionality that you've put into this. It comes out in every pixel, whether it be the story, the art, or you brought a pro in for the music who's known for their work in the space. All of this just added up to what I'm looking at now on Steam as overwhelmingly positive results and reviews. Everyone's loving it. It's on itch.io. It's on Fireflower. It's on Steam. It sounds like a pretty darn successful launch, and I give you all the congratulations that I possibly can for that.
Thank you so much, Scott.
You can check out The Crimson Diamond at thecrimsondiamond.com. You can get links to Steam, Itch, Fireflower, and more. Also, as developers, be sure to check out the Crimson Diamond Dev blog, where Julia talks about the development, the launch, the process, and there's lots of great animated GIFs to give you a sense of what this looks like, as well as merch, too. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.